September 8, 1943. The limestone hills above Brindisi, Italy. Captain Alessandro Marini knelt in the darkness beside a shallow depression in the rocky soil, his hands gripping a Carcano rifle he'd carried since the invasion of Greece 3 years earlier. Around him, 42 Italian soldiers of the 42nd Infantry Regiment sat in silence, watching as he placed the weapon into the earth. The metal was cold. The wood stock bore scratches from 1,000 different positions, different battles, different wars that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. One by one, the others came forward. Lieutenant Giuseppe Romano laid down his rifle beside the captain's. Sergeant Enzo Cavalli placed his carefully, almost reverently. Private Marco Benedetti, barely 19 years old, hesitated before adding his weapon to the growing pile. They worked without speaking, their movements deliberate and slow, as if they were burying more than just rifles in that Italian hillside. Above them, the stars were impossibly bright. The Mediterranean stretched dark and vast to the east. Somewhere in that darkness, German soldiers were hunting for them. Somewhere in those hills, other units of their army were making similar choices, facing similar impossibilities. But here, in this moment, these 42 men were alone with a decision that would define everything that followed. The reason they were burying their weapons instead of carrying them, the reason they were about to become something other than soldiers, had begun 6 hours earlier with a radio transmission that changed everything. That morning, Italy had signed an armistice with the Allied forces. After 3 years of fighting alongside Nazi Germany, the Italian government had surrendered. But the announcement hadn't brought peace. It had brought chaos. German forces, anticipating Italian betrayal, had already positioned troops throughout Italy. The moment the armistice was announced, Wehrmacht units moved swiftly to disarm Italian soldiers, seize strategic positions, and secure control of the peninsula. In Rome, in Milan, in countless barracks and bases across Italy, German soldiers confronted their former allies with a simple choice: join us or be imprisoned. For units stationed in the Balkans, in Greece, in the occupied territories, the situation was even more desperate. Captain Marini's regiment had been stationed near Brindisi, guarding the Adriatic coast. When the armistice came, they found themselves surrounded by German forces who moved with the efficiency of an army that had planned for exactly this contingency. The German commander had been direct. Italian soldiers would be disarmed and transported to Germany as laborers. Officers would be separated and sent to prisoner of war camps. Anyone who resisted would be shot. The regiment had been given until dawn to assemble for processing. Instead, Marini and 42 men who trusted him had slipped away in the darkness. They'd walked east, away from their barracks, away from their German captors, into the limestone hills that offered concealment but little else. They had weapons, but carrying them made them targets. They had uniforms, but wearing them made them prisoners. They had training, but conventional military tactics were useless against an occupying force that controlled every road, every port, every city. What they needed was a different kind of war. A war fought without uniforms, without formations, without the rules that had governed their lives as soldiers. But that transformation required shedding everything they'd been trained to be. It required burying the identity they'd carried for years and becoming something new. So here they were, in the darkness, placing their rifles in the earth. When the last weapon had been added to the pile, Captain Marini began covering them with stones and dirt. The others joined him. They worked quickly now, with urgency, knowing that German patrols would be searching these hills by morning. The rifles disappeared beneath limestone rocks and red soil. The bayonets, the ammunition belts, the military equipment that marked them as soldiers, all of it went into the ground. What remained were 42 men in Italian army uniforms with no weapons, no supplies, and no clear plan beyond survival. But they were free. Free from their obligations to an army that no longer existed, free from the rules that had governed military conduct, free to fight the war on their own terms. Private Benedetti watched the burial with an expression that was difficult to read. Fear, perhaps. Or relief. Or the strange combination of both that comes when you realize that everything you understood about your life has just been erased. What are we now? He asked quietly. If we're not soldiers. Captain Marini stood, brushing dirt from his hands. He looked at the young private, then at the others who waited in the darkness for an answer. We're whatever we need to be, he said finally. The limestone hills above Brindisi, Italy. Captain Alessandro Marini knelt in the darkness beside and shallow the language and looked like everyone else, his hands gripping a Carcano rifle. Can't imprison what they can't identify. Greece 3 years earlier. But how do we fight? Around him, Sergeant Cavalli, Italian soldiers of the 42nd Infantry Regiment sat in silence. The captain's expression was grim. The weapon into the earth. We fight by not dying. The metal was cold. We fight by surviving when they expect us from 1,000 different positions. We fight by becoming invisible. Wars that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. We fight however we can. One by one, the others came forward. Speech. Lieutenant Giuseppe Romano laid down his rifle beside the captain's. But it was honest. Sergeant Enzo Cavalli placed his was what these men needed as they stood in the darkness. Private Marco Benedetti, the last physical connection to their identity as soldiers, hesitated before adding his weapon. The Germans would expect partisan resistance. They worked without speaking, operating from the mountains, deliberate and slow, ambushes, as if they were burying more than just rifles. That kind of resistance could be hunted, surrounded. Above them, the stars were impossibly bright. What Marini was proposing was something more subtle and more dangerous to the east. Not disappearing into the mountains, but German soldiers were hunting for them. Some were becoming warriors, other units of their army were making similar choices. They left the burial site similar possibilities, moving in small groups of 3 or 4. In this moment, separating to minimize detection, men were alone with a decision Marini's that would define everything that followed. Disperse. Find civilian clothes, the reason they were burying the weapons instead of carrying them, and the reason they were about to become something other than soldiers without drawing attention. 6 hours earlier with a radio transmission that rather than everything. Men who appeared to accept German rule. Italy had signed an armistice with the Allied forces. It was a gamble based on assumptions about fighting alongside Nazi geography. The Italian government had surrendered. The Germans controlled the cities and major roads, hadn't brought rural Italy was a maze of hill towns. It had brought chaos, mountain villages, and German agricultural communities anticipating Italians and locals had already positioned troops throughout Italy. If Marini's men could integrate into those communities, the armistice was announced, they could create a resistance network that was nearly to disarm Italian soldiers, seize strategic positions, they had to survive the next 48 hours. In Rome, patrols were searching the hills systematically, and bases across Italian soldiers who fled rather than surrender. Their former allies with a collaborators and informants were reporting suspicious movements. For units stationed in the Balkans, disappearing was closing rapidly in the occupied territory. As the sun rose over the Adriatic on September 9th, Captain Marini's regiment had been stationed near soldiers 12 hours earlier walked down from the hills in different directions. When the armistice came toward different villages, they found themselves surrounded by German forces who moved with the efficiency of an army that had planned for exactly this contingency, which in a sense they were. The German commander had been from an army that no longer existed. Italian soldiers would be disarmed and transported to Germany as laborers in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Officers would be separated and sent to prisoner walking alone toward a village he remembered. Anyone who resisted would be shot. Thought about the rifles they buried. The regiment had been given until dawn to assemble for processing. If they survived, if the war ended the way everyone hoped it would, 42 men might find those weapons slipped away in the darkness. They'd wonder about the men who'd left them there, away from their barracks, away from their German captors, into the limestone hills that offered concealment but little else. Right now, they had weapons, in the autumn sunshine, carrying them made them toward an uncertain future. They had only one question wearing them made them prisoners. What does resistance look like when you buried your weapons? But conventional military tactics were useless against an occupying force that controlled every road, every port, every city. What they needed was a different kind of war. A war fought without uniforms, without formations, without the rules that had governed their lives as soldiers. But that transformation required shedding everything they'd been trained to be. It required burying the identity they'd carried for years and becoming something new. So here they were, in the darkness, placing their rifles in the earth. When the last weapon had been added to the pile, Captain Marini began covering them with stones and dirt. The others joined him. They worked quickly now, with urgency, knowing that German patrols would be searching these hills by morning. The rifles disappeared beneath limestone rocks and red soil. The bayonets, the ammunition belts, the military equipment that marked them as soldiers, all of it went into the ground. What remained were 42 men in Italian army uniforms with no weapons, no supplies, and no clear plan beyond survival. But they were free. Free from their obligations to an army that no longer existed, free from the rules that had governed military conduct, free to fight the war on their own terms. Private Benedetti watched the burial with an expression that was difficult to read. Fear, perhaps. Or relief. Or the strange combination of both that comes when you realize that everything you understood about your life has just been erased. What are we now? He asked quietly. If we're not soldiers. Captain Marini stood, brushing dirt from his hands. He looked at the young private, then at the others who waited in the darkness for an answer. The transformation began with small things. The limestone hills above Brindisi, the kinds of things that didn't look like resistance at all. Captain Alessandro Marini knelt in the darkness beside a shallow depression in the rocky soil, his hands farmhand on his uncle's olive estates outside the invasion of Greece 3 years earlier. The work was genuine, The olives needed harvesting, 42 Italian soldiers of the 42nd Infantry Regiment sat in silence, more valuable than watching as he placed the weapon into the earth. It gave him access to the roads that wound through the hills, carrying German supply convoys twice from 1,000 different positions. It gave him time to notice patterns, wars that now felt like the predictable rhythms of occupation. One by one, the others came forward. Not Lieutenant at first. Giuseppe Romano laid down his rifle beside the captain, noting details. Sergeant Enzo Cavalli placed his heaviest, almost reverently. Which drivers seemed Private Marco Benedetti, barely 19 years old, most alert, hesitated before adding his weapon to the growing pile. Information with no immediate without speaking, collected and remembered against a day when it might matter. As if they were burying more than Sergeant Enzo Cavalli found work at the port in Brindisi. Above them, and unloading ships that supplied German positions throughout the Balkans. The Mediterranean stretched dark and vast to the east, and deliberately demoralizing. Somewhere in that the Germans made sure German soldiers were understood their subordinate status. Somewhere in those hills, but other units of their army were making similar choices. He knew what materials mattered for military operations. But here, in this moment, these 42 men were alone with a decision that would define everything. He could recognize the markings on fuel drums. The reason they were burying their weapons instead of carrying them, and the reason they were about to become something other than soldiers. The wrong cranes ended up on the wrong ship. A radio transmission that changed everything. Or labels fell off in the confusion of loading. That morning, Italy had signed an armistice with the Allied leak that contaminated its contents. After 3 years of fighting alongside Nazi Germany, the Italian government had surrendered. Never quite enough to warrant investigation. It had brought chaos, friction in a logistics system that depended on anticipating Italian betrayal, had already positioned troops throughout became something else entirely. The moment the armistice was announced, a lawyer before the war, units moved skilled with to disarm Italian soldiers, seize strategic positions, Italy, and secure control of the peninsula. German administration required permits, in countless barracks and bases across Italy. Endless German soldiers confronted their former allies with a simple choice: who could survive, join us or be imprisoned. Romano found employment as a stationed in the municipal office in Taranto, in the occupied territories. He had the right education, the right man more desperate, the right understanding of how Captain Marini's regiment had been stationed near Brindisi. The Germans needed Italians who could manage the bureaucratic machinery. When the armistice came to handle themselves, they found themselves surrounded by German forces who moved with the efficiency of an army that had planned for exactly this contingency. He stamped documents. The German commander had been direct. Among the hundreds of Italian soldiers would be disarmed and transported to Germany as laborers. Documents that shouldn't exist. Officers would be separated and sent to prisoner of war camps to access restricted areas. Anyone who resisted would be shot when the Germans came looking. The regiment had been given until dawn to assemble for processing. People who existed in the records Marini and 42 men who trusted him had slipped away and transferred to other districts, other camps, other jurisdictions away from their inquiries would be buried in bureaucratic confusion, into the limestone hills that offered concealment but never predictably. They had weapons, but enough that the German system made them so efficient on paper, began developing gaps, but wearing them made them Captain Marini, the man who led them into the hills that conventional military tactics were useless against an occupying force that outside every road needed someone to instruct children in mathematics and history. What they needed was a different kind of war. The credentials. A war fought without uniforms, he had without formations, quiet, without the rules that had governed their lives as soldiers. German authorities didn't suspect. But that transformation required shedding everything they'd been trained to be to something more valuable than weapons. It required burying the identity they carried for years and becoming something of a rural community. So here they were, parents came to him with concerns about their rifles in the earth. Local officials consulted him on community matters. Pile, Captain Marini began covering them with stones and dirt. The postmaster saved newspapers for him. They worked quickly now, with urgency, had become integrated into German patrols would be searching in a way that made him invisible to German security services disappeared beneath limestone rocks and happening in the region. The bayonets, he didn't organize partisan bells, the military equipment that marked down his soldiers, all of it went into the ground. And what remained were 42 men in Italian army uniforms. When someone mentioned something useful, no supplies, German weakness, and no clear plan beyond survival, he knew who among the scattered 42 could act on that information. Free from their obligations to an army because they were no longer existed, free from the rules that military channels or organized resistance to fight the war on their own terms. But through subtle contacts that looked like nothing at all. Benedetti watched the burial with an expression that was difficult to read. Vegetables to the port where Cavalli worked, perhaps. A friend who stopped by the village school on market days. Or the strange combination of both letters that passed through Romano's office. You understood about your life as just someone who knew how to read between the lines. What are we now? He asked quietly. The transformation was psychological as much as tactical. Captain Marini's soldiers trained to win battles through superior force and coordinated action. He looked at the young private, then at the others who waited in a different kind of warfare, answer, one that measured success not in territory captured but in small acts of disruption that accumulated over time. Private Benedetti saw it clearly one afternoon in November. He was working in the olive groves when a German convoy stopped at the estate, looking for partisans reported in the area. Benedetti watched from behind the trees as officers questioned his uncle, demanding to know if any strangers had been seen, any suspicious activity noticed. His uncle lied perfectly. Convincingly. Not heroically or dramatically, but with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent a lifetime dealing with officials who asked inconvenient questions. No, he hadn't seen strangers. Yes, he'd report anything suspicious. The officers left, satisfied. After they'd gone, Benedetti's uncle found him in the grove. "You should leave," the older man said quietly. "For your safety and mine." September 8, Benedetti replied. "Where would I go?" The limestone hills above Brindisi. His uncle studied him for a long moment. Captain Alessandro Marini knelt in the darkness beside a shallow depression in the rocky soil, his hands gripping a Carcano rifle he'd carried since the invasion of Greece rather than surrender it. Around decided that 42 Italian soldiers of the 42nd Infantry Regiment. The older man nodded slowly, watching as he placed the weapon into the earth. "It means making them work for everything. The Woodstock bore scratches from 1,000 duty a little harder, a little slower, a little less that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. They control the ground, but we control the friction. One by one, the others came forward. And friction is what stops armies." Lieutenant Giuseppe Romano laid down his rifle Benedetti had articulated what they were becoming. Sergeant Enzo Cavalli placed his carefully, almost not even partisans in the traditional sense. Private Marco Benedetti, barely 19 years old, hesitated before adding his weapon to the cost of occupation. The thousand small ways that a conquered population deliberate and slow, make conquest as if they were burying more than just the Germans noticed eventually. Above the specific the stars were those were too small, too dispersed. The Mediterranean stretched dark and vast to the accident. Somewhere in that darkness, German soldiers were hunting for them. Supply operations took longer than scheduled. Somewhere in those hills, other units of their army were making similar mysterious delays, facing similar impossibilities. Local laborers worked with maddening slowness. In this moment, these 42 men were alone with decisions as communities closed ranks against informants. The reason they were burying their weapons became more frequent. The reason they were about to become more aggressive than soldiers had begun 6 hours earlier with a radio transmission made it changed everything. The more supply, Italy had signed an armistice with the Allied forces. In January 1944, after 3 years of fighting alongside Nazi Germany through the network, the Italian government had surrendered. The Germans were planning a major roundup of suspected resistance members. It had brought chaos. Lists had been compiled. German forces, among the names were 3 of his original 42, had already positioned troops throughout Italy. Warned them to flee. The moment the armistice was announced, he did something more subtle. Units moved swiftly to Romano's contacts in the administrative strategic positions, documentation and secured showing that all 3 men had been transferred to labor details in northern Italy, in countless barracks and bases across Italy. The paperwork was German soldiers confronted their former allies with a simple choice: join us. When German security services came looking for units stationed in the Balkans, but paper trails that led nowhere occupied territories, the situation was even more targeted. Captain Marini's regiment had been stationed near danger that had been diverted by documents that shouldn't exist. When the armistice came, was when Marini understood that they completed German forces who moved with the efficiency of an army something new, planned for not soldiers, not partisans, but participants in a different kind of resistance. Italian soldiers would be disarmed and transported to Germany as spectacular enough to make headlines. Officers would be separated and sent to prison by making occupation unbearable. Not anyone who resisted would be accumulated frustration. The regiment had been given until dawn to refusing to make victory easy. Instead, by ensuring Marini that every German efficiency was met with Italian away in the darkness. That every attempt to control away from their passive obstruction, away from their German captors, that every effort to extract resources that offered Italy cost more than the resources were worth. They had weapons. It wasn't carrying them made them targets. It didn't feel like they had uniforms, but it was resistance nonetheless. They had training, resistance, but conventional military tactics were useless against an occupying force that controlled every road, no partisans in the mountains. What they needed was a different kind of war. Just ordinary Italians going about ordinary lives, being slightly less cooperative than governed their lives as soldiers. The rifles they buried that September night remained everything they'd been trained to be. They'd become irrelevant. It required burying the identity these men had discovered years and sometimes the most effective weapon is the one you don't fire. So here they were, in the darkness, placing their rifles in the earth. When the last weapon had been added to the pile, Captain Marini began covering them with stones and dirt. The others joined him. They worked quickly now, with urgency, knowing that German patrols would be searching these hills by morning. The rifles disappeared beneath limestone rocks and red soil. The bayonets, the ammunition belts, the military equipment that marked them as soldiers, all of it went into the ground. What remained were 42 men in Italian army uniforms with no weapons, no supplies, and no clear plan beyond survival. But they were free. Free from their obligations to an army that no longer existed, free from the rules that had governed military conduct, free to fight the war on their own terms. Private Benedetti watched the burial with an expression that was difficult to read. Fear, perhaps. Or relief. Or the strange combination of both that comes when you realize that everything you understood about your life has just been erased. What are we now? He asked quietly. If we're not soldiers. Captain Marini stood, brushing dirt from his hands. He looked at the young private, then at the others who waited in the darkness for an answer. The consequences unfolded slowly, like water wearing away the limestone hills above Brindisi. By March 1944, German Captain Alessandro Marini knelt in the darkness beside a shallow depression in the rocky soil, who prided themselves on the Romano rifle he'd carried since the invasion of Greece 3 years earlier. No bridges blown, around no convoys 42 Italian soldiers of the 42nd Infantry Regiment sat in silence, watching operations that should have taken hours required days. The metal was cold. Supplies that should have arrived on schedule appeared late from 1,000 different positions. Italian laborers who should have been productive worked at a pace that bordered on insulting without quite crossing into open defiance. One by one, the others came forward. The Germans responded as Lieutenant Giuseppe Romano laid down his rifle beside the captain's. More checkpoints, expanded Sergeant Enzo Cavalli placed his carefully, but each new control mechanism required additional Private Marco Benedetti, and barely 19 years old, hesitated before adding his weapon to the growing pile. The occupation was consuming resources at a rate that hadn't been deliberate and slow, as if they were burying more than just rifles. Still working in the olive groves, had become invaluable to his uncle's estate. The stars were impossibly bright. He knew where the best olives grew. The Mediterranean stretched dark and vast to the east. He understood which trees needed attention. Somewhere in that darkness, he worked hard. German soldiers were hunting for when German officers made their periodic inspections of other units of their army were making similar choices. But his real value lay in what he learned about the patterns of German logistics. But here, in this moment, supply convoys that passed through the hills followed predictable routes and predictable times. Guards were alerted at the beginning of their shift instead of less so after hours. The reason they were about to become something other than soldiers. Certain trucks always carried specific material, radio transmission that changed everything. This information passed through the Italy network, had signed an armistice with the Allied forces, verbally, through channels that looked like ordinary fighting alongside Nazi Germany. The Italian visited on Market Day. But the announcement stopped by to share wine. It had conversations about harvests and weather. German forces, embedded in ordinary Italian betrayal, details had already positioned troops throughout rotations. The moment the armistice was announced, who could Wehrmacht units moved swiftly to disarm Italian soldiers that would have brought strategic positions, and secure control of the peninsula. For knowing when roads would be clear, in countless barracks and bases where German attention was focused and where it wasn't their former allies with a simple choice, opportunities, join us or be imprisoned. In April, an entire shipment of ammunition destined for German positions fighting the Allied territories, Monte Cassino, the situation was even more desperate. Brindisi and Naples. Captain Marini's investigation was exhaustive but fruitless, guarding the Adriatic coast. The truck had departed on schedule. When the armistice came, the driver, an Italian under German forces who moved with the efficiency of an army that had planned for exactly this coastal road, the ammunition the German commander had been not stolen, just Italian soldiers would be disarmed and transported to Germany as laborers. The truck had developed mechanical problems. Officers would be separated and sent to prisoner of war camps. By the time repairs were made, he'd been redirected to a different destination with a different cargo. The regiment had been given until dawn to assemble was in perfect order. Instead, the ammunition was eventually found. Men who trusted later had slipped in a warehouse in Bari, mislabeled. They'd walked east, away from their barracks, away from their German captors, into the limestone hills that offered concealment. The Germans recovered the shipment but couldn't recover the time lost during carrying them made them at Cassino. They had uniforms, but wearing them made them prisoners. Maintained perfect deniability. They had training, but conventional military tactics were useless against an occupying force that controlled every road. He never made mistakes obvious enough to warrant punishment. What they needed was a different kind of war. Labels that were similar but not quite without formations, without the rules that had governed their lives as different from what actually got loaded. But that transformation required shedding everything they'd been trained to nothing but collectively ensured that burying the identity they carried slightly less and becoming something new. So here they were, in the darkness, placing their rifles in the discovered they had the wrong ammunition. When the last weapon had been added to the pile, fuel allocation fell short of operational requirements. The medical supplies destined for field hospitals arrived late with urgency, knowing that German patrols shortages were catastrophic by morning. None could be traced disappeared beneath limestone rocks and but they were persistent, maddening, the bayonets, costly, the ammunition belts, Lieutenant Romano's work in the administrative offices had perhaps the most insidious long-term effects. What remained were careful manipulation of documents created not chaos but confusion, no supplies, bureaucratic and no clear nothing could be verified with absolute certainty. But they were free. Did this person exist? Free from their obligations to an army that no longer existed, free from the rules that had governed military conduct, free to fight the war on their own terms. In May 1944, Romano created Private Benedetti indicating that a Waffen-SS unit that was difficult to the Eastern Front had already been transferred south to reinforce positions against the Allied advance in Italy. Or the strange combination of both that comes when you realize that everything you understood about your life has just been erased, filed through appropriate channels. What are we now? he asked quietly. By the time the error was discovered, if we're not soldiers, weeks had passed, and the unit's actual deployment had been delayed while administrative offices in 3 different cities tried to reconcile contradictory paperwork. Then at the others who waited in the darkness for an answer. The SS officer responsible for the deployment never determined how the false orders had been created or who'd introduced them into the system. Romano, working quietly in his municipal office, processing routine permits and certificates, never drew suspicion. These were the consequences the 42 had created, not through violence but through multiplication of friction. Each small act of inefficiency, each bureaucratic confusion, each logistical delay was insignificant alone. But there were hundreds of them, then thousands, spreading through the occupation apparatus like a virus. German commanders knew something was wrong but couldn't identify the cause. They could see the effects: operations that took too long, supplies that arrived too late, communications that got garbled, but couldn't trace them to a source. There were no resistance cells to infiltrate, no partisan bands to hunt, no saboteurs to interrogate. Just ordinary Italians doing ordinary work, being slightly less competent than the Germans required. The British intelligence officer who eventually pieced together parts of the story, long after the war, would describe it as administrative guerrilla warfare. Resistance without weapons. Sabotage without explosives. Warfare conducted through the patient exploitation of bureaucratic complexity. But there were consequences for the resistors as well. Captain September 8, teaching in his village school, maintained his limestone hills above Brindisi. The Germans never suspected the quiet academic Alessandro Marini children in mathematics beside his shallow depression in the rocky soil. But the work took its toll in ways that weren't immediately visible. Since the invasion of Greece 3 years earlier, he taught children whose fathers were dead or imprisoned. 42 Italian soldiers of the German soldiers patrol his village, sat in silence, knowing that a single mistake, he placed a momentary lapse in his careful performance, the medal would bring death not just to him but to the community that scratches from 1,000 different positions. The psychological weight of constant deception, wars that living always on the edge of someone else's life, knowing that people's lives one by one his ability to maintain a lie. It changed. Lieutenant Giuseppe Romano laid down his rifle beside the captain's. Private Benedetti, Sergeant Enzo Cavalli placed his scarf sleeping almost reverently. He'd dream about Marco Benedetti, about Germans discovering the information he'd hesitated before adding his weapons to the growing pile. Sergeant Cavalli developed a nervous habit of touching deliberate and slow, feeling for the identification more than just rifles. He was an Italian laborer rather than a soldier in hiding. Above them, the stars were impossibly Romano began drinking more than he should. The Mediterranean stretched thoughts about the lives his forgeries had saved and the lives somewhere in that darkness, German soldiers were hunting for them, living between identities. Somewhere in those hills, other units of their army were making similar choices, facing similar impossibilities. They buried their rifles and with them, part of who they'd been. In this moment, these 42 men were alone with a decision that would define everything that followed. The network they'd created, the reason they were burying their weapons and scattered across southern Italy, the reason they were about to become something other than shared purpose, had begun 6 hours earlier with a radio transmission that changed everything. Inevitably. That morning, Italy had signed an armistice with the Allied forces. Had been arrested in separate incidents. After betrayed by and fighting alongside Nazi Germany, the Italian government had surrendered. 2 had been sent to labor camps, but the announcement hadn't brought peace. 2 had simply vanished. It had brought chaos. Their fates unknown. German forces, the remaining anticipating Italian betrayal, more carefully had already positioned troops of how fragile their situation was. The moment the armistice was announced, day of survival felt like a small victory to disarm Italian soldiers. Each week without disaster felt like a miracle, and secure control of the peninsula. They transformed themselves from soldiers into something else, Milan, but they countless barracks and bases across the didn't live with German soldiers confronted their former allies with a simple choice. When Allied forces finally liberated Rome and began their advance in the Balkans, the consequences of everything the occupied had done became visible. The situation was even more German units retreating from southern Italy found their logistics and stationed near Brindisi. Supply lines that had been nearly inefficient became completely unreliable. They found themselves surrounded by German forces who moved with the efficiency of an army that had planned for exactly this occupation, weakened by a year of subtle resistance, began to fail when it was Italian soldiers would be disarmed and transported to Germany as laborers. They blamed Italian separated and sent to partisan sabotage, Allied bombing. Anyone who resisted would be shot. The regiment had been given until dawn to their rifles had fought a different kind of war, instead that left no bodies and no men who trusted him had slipped away in the darkness. By August, when Allied forces away from their barracks, most of their German captors had revealed themselves into the limestone hills that offered concealment but little else. Admitted what they'd been doing. They tried to explain to bemused British officers why they'd fought without weapons. They had uniforms, the officers didn't really understand. They were soldiers, but conventional military tactics were useless against an occupying force that controlled every road, to comprehend warfare measured in mislabeled cargo. What they needed was a different kind of war. But they recognized effectiveness when they saw it. Without formation, German operations in southern Italy had their lives as soldiers mysteriously dysfunctional. But that transformation required shedding everything the Allied advance easier, faster. It required burying the identity they'd carried for years and becoming something new. With Captain Marini and liberated Brindisi, they were, in the dark question that had placing their rifles in the earth. Did it matter? When the last weapon had been added to the pile, Captain Marini began for a long time with stones and dirt. I don't know, he said. The others joined him. We made it harder quickly now, with urgency. We cost them time and resources and efficiency. Searching these hills by morning. Whether that was worth a year of our lives. The rifles disappeared beneath limestone rocks and red soil, unable to finish. The bayonets, we survived. The ammunition belts, Benedetti the military equipment that marked them as soldiers. Marini all of it went into the ground. We fought without dying. What remained were 42 men in Italian army uniforms with no weapons. It would have to be enough. No supplies, and because there was no other measure for the kind of resistance they'd conducted. But they were free. No battle honors from their obligations to an army that no longer existed. No medals for mislabeled cargo that had governed military conduct. No recognition for surviving by becoming invisible. Private buried their rifles together with an expression that was difficult to read. The consequence was that they'd won a war no one could see. Or relief. Or the strange combination of both that comes when you realize that everything you understood about your life has just been erased. What are we now? He asked quietly. If we're not soldiers. Captain Marini stood, brushing dirt from his hands. He looked at the young private, then at the others who waited in the darkness for an answer. 79 years later, in a research archive in Rome, the limestone hills would discover something unusual. Italy. The documents Alessandro Marini knelt in the darkness beside a shallow depression in the rocky soil, his hands gripping a September 1943 to August 1943 years earlier. Individually, around him, they told 42 Italian soldiers of the 42nd Infantry Regiment sat in silence that didn't quite match as he placed the weapon into the earth. Administrative records showing transfers that couldn't be verified. The woodstock bore scratches from personnel files documenting soldiers who vanished from German wars that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. But when assembled chronologically and mapped, the others came forward. They revealed a pattern. Lieutenant Giuseppe Romano laid down his rifle beside the southern Italian coastal region. Sergeant Enzo Cavalli placed his carefully, occurred with almost consistency. Private Marco Benedetti, barely 19 years old, hesitated before adding his weapon to the growing yet pile. Not organized in any way that matched known partisan operations. Their movements deliberate and slow. The historian, as if they were burying more than just rifles searching for explanations. Years of research led to scattered interviews with elderly Italians. The Mediterranean stretched dark and vast to the east. Brief mentions in post-war debriefings. Somewhere in that darkness, German soldiers were hunting the story emerged. Somewhere in those story hills, of 42 units of their army were making similar choices, facing similar impossibilities. By the time the complete picture became clear, most of those 42 were gone. These 42 men were alone with a decision that would define even those who survived occupation and resistance. The reason they were burying their weapons they once believed about warfare. The reason they were about to become something other than soldiers. Elderly men with long memories and complicated radio transmission that changed everything. One of them was Marco Benedetti. Italy had signed an armistice with the Allied forces, living quietly in Lecce with his grandchildren. After 3 years of fighting alongside Nazi Germany, found him and asked about that night in September 1943. But the announcement had buried their rifles in the hills above Brindisi. It had brought chaos. Benedetti was silent for a long time. German forces, anticipating Italian temporary choice, had already positioned troops throughout Italy. We thought we'd hide the moment the armistice was in the occupation. Wehrmacht dig them up when the time was right to disarm Italian soldiers. But we never went back strategic positions and secure the war ended. The peninsula. I thought about it sometimes. In Rome, in Milan, thought about going to those barracks and bases across Italy where we buried German soldiers confronted their former allies with a simple choice. Why not join us or be in prison? Benedetti's expression was difficult to read. For units stationed in the Balkans, because by the time the war ended, I realized those rifles represented everything that had to become in order to survive. Captain Marini's regiment had been stationed near Brindisi, not by killing, guarding the Adriatic to make killing easy. When the armistice came, whose weapon was patience and surrounded by German forces who moved with the efficiency of an army that had planned for exactly along with the guns. The German commander had been going backward. Italian soldiers would be disarmed and transported to Germany as laborers. Do you think what you did mattered? Officers would be separated and sent to prisoner of war camps. I don't know. Benedetti who resisted would be shot. We made things harder. The regiment had been given until dawn to assemble for time and resources. Instead, did that Marini change the 42 men who trusted him probably not away in the darkness. The Allies were always going to win once they invaded their barracks, away from their German captors. Maybe we made the limestone hills that offered concealment but little else. Maybe we saved some lives by making German operations a little less targets. He had uniforms, looking at his hands, wearing them made them prisoners now, marked by a lifetime of work. But conventional military tactics found a way to resist that didn't get us killed. That controlled every road, maybe that's all it was, every city. Survival dressed up as was a different kind of war. I've thought about that question for 79 years, and I still don't have an answer. Without the rules that had governed their lives as soldiers. What Benedetti and the historian didn't know was that the rifles were still required buried in the limestone hills above Brindisi. It required
over the
varying
decades,
the identity
the landscape
for
had
years
changed.
and becoming something new.
Development had crept across
so here
the
they were,
hillsides.
in the darkness,
The
placing
exact
their
location
rifles
where
and
they
they
buried
the weapons had been covered
When the
by a
last
small
weapon had
vineyard,
been added
planted
to the pile,
in the 1960s
Captain
by
Marini
farmers
began
who never
covering
knew
them
what
with
lay
stones
beneath
and
their
dirt.
vines.
The
The
others
weapons
joined
would
him.
corrode slowly in the
They worked
Italian
quickly
soil,
now,
metal
with urgency,
returning to rust,
knowing that
wood
German
returning to
patrols
earth.
would be searching these hills by
Someday,
morning.
perhaps,
Someone would
rifles
find them,
disappeared
a
beneath
construction
limestone
crew or
rocks and red
agricultural
soil.
worker,
Stumbling
the
across a
bayonets,
cache of
the
rifles
ammunition
that predated
belts,
any records
the military
they could find.
equipment that marked them as soldiers.
It would be a minor
all
mystery,
of it went into
briefly
the ground.
interesting to local historians.
What remained were 42 men in Italian army uniforms,
but the real legacy
with no
of those
weapons,
42
no
men
supplies,
wasn't buried in the
and
ground.
no clear plan beyond survival.
Their legacy lived in how they
But they were
redefined
free.
what resistance could mean.
Free from their obligations
They
to an
demonstrated
army
that
that
you
no
didn't
longer
need guns
existed,
to fight occupation.
free from the rules that had governed
That
military
sometimes the
conduct,
most effective
free to
warfare
fight the war
was
on
the
their
kind
own
that looked like
terms.
nothing at all.
Private Benedetti
That
watched the
bureaucratic
burial with an
resistance
expression
could be as
that was
damaging
difficult
as
to
armed
read,
resistance,
and far
fear,
harder to
perhaps.
combat.
This
Or
understanding would influence
or the
resistance
strange
movements for
combination of
decades.
both that comes when you
In
realize that
occupied
everything you
territories
understood
throughout
about
the
your
20th
life has just
century,
been erased.
people would discover,
What are we
sometimes
now?
explicitly
He asked
learning from
quietly.
Italian resistance,
If
sometimes
soldiers,
independently reaching similar
Captain
conclusions,
Marini stood,
that
rushing
occupation
dirt
could be
from his
made
hands.
unbearable through nonviolent
He
means.
looked at the young private,
through
then at the others
slowdowns
who
and
waited in the
inefficiencies
darkness for an answer.
through bureaucratic obstruction, through the patient multiplication of small acts that accumulated into major disruption. The civil rights movement in America would use similar tactics. Anti-colonial resistance movements would recognize the same principles. Dissidents under totalitarian regimes would understand the power of making systems dysfunction without providing targets for repression. None of these movements traced their lineage directly to 42 Italian soldiers who buried their rifles in 1943. But they shared a fundamental insight that those men had discovered: sometimes resistance means not fighting in the way your enemy expects. Sometimes it means becoming invisible while staying present. Sometimes it means winning through patience rather than violence. Captain Alessandro Marini led them into the hills that September the limestone hills
lived
above
until
Brindisi,
1992.
Italy. He became a professor of history after the darkness beside a shallow depression in the rocky soil. His hands
never
gripping a
spoke publicly
about what he and his men had done during the occupation 3 years earlier. But in his private
Around
papers,
him,
discovered
42
after his
Italian
death,
soldiers of
there
the
was a
42nd
single entry
Infantry
from September
Regiment
8,
sat in silence,
1973,
watching as he placed the
30th
weapon into the
anniversary
earth.
of the night they buried their
The metal
rifles.
was cold.
We fought a
The
war that
Woodstock
left
bore
no
scratches
scratches
from
from
a
1,000
wrote.
different positions.
We
different
won victories
battles,
that no one
different
could
wars
see.
that now felt like they
We
belonged to
became
someone
heroes
else's
who
life.
would never be celebrated.
One by one,
And
the
we
others came
survived,
forward, which was perhaps the greatest
Lieutenant
victory
Giuseppe
of all.
Romano laid down his
Not
rifle
because
beside the
survival is
captain's.
inherently noble, but
Sergeant
because we
Enzo
survived
Cavalli
while
placed
maintaining
our
our
humanity,
almost
our
reverently.
dignity, our refusal to
Private
accept
Marco
that power
Benedetti,
must be met
barely
with power.
19 years old,
The
hesitated
rifles we
before
buried
adding his
represented
weapon
the
to
kind
the
of
growing
warfare we
pile.
rejected.
They worked
Not
without
because
speaking,
we were
their
pacifists,
movements
we
deliberate
weren't,
and slow,
but because
as
we
if they were
understood that
burying
the
more
real
than
battle
just
wasn't
rifles
for
in their
territory
Italian
or
supremacy.
Above
It was
them,
for the right
the
to
stars
resist
were
in ways that
impossibly
the
bright.
occupier couldn't comprehend.
The
or
Mediterranean
combat.
stretched dark and
We
vast
fought
to
by
the
being
east.
ungovernable without being
Somewhere in
openly
that
rebellious.
darkness, German
By
soldiers were
being
hunting
present
for
but
them.
elusive. Somewhere in
By
those
accepting
hills,
that other
sometimes
units
the
of
most
their
powerful
army were
stands
making
is the one that looks like submission
facing
but
similar
conceals possible
impossibilities.
refusal. But here,
I don't know
in
if we
this
changed
moment,
history.
these 42 men were
But I know
alone
we
with a
changed
decision that would
ourselves.
define everything that followed.
And perhaps that's enough.
The reason they were
On
burying
a
their
hillside
weapons
above
instead of
Brindisi,
carrying them
beneath
the
vines
reason
that
they were about
produced
to
wine
become
sold
something
throughout
other than
Europe,
soldiers,
42
had begun
rifles
6
still
hours
rest in the
earlier
earth
with a
where
radio
desperate men
transmission
placed
that
them
changed
7
everything.
decades ago.
That morning,
They're anonymous
Italy
now.
had signed
These
an
weapons,
armistice with the Allied forces.
the men who buried them are mostly
After 3
gone,
years
and
of
the
fighting
few who
alongside
remain
Nazi
carry
Germany,
memories that feel
the Italian
increasingly
government
distant,
had surrendered.
like stories from someone
But the
else's
announcement
life.
hadn't brought peace.
But the choice those men
It had
made that
brought
September
chaos.
night, to bury their
German
weapons
forces,
and keep fighting
anticipating
anyway,
Italian
resonates
betrayal,
still.
had already
It
positioned
resonates
troops
in every
throughout
act
Italy.
of resistance that
The
succeeds
moment
through
the
patience
armistice
rather
was
than
announced,
violence.
Wehrmacht units moved
In every
swiftly to
victory,
disarm
one through
Italian
persistence
soldiers
rather than
for
force.
strategic positions.
In
and
every
secure
demonstration
control
that
of the
power has
peninsula.
limits and that sometimes
In
the
Rome,
strongest
in
stands
Milan,
is the one that
in countless
refuses to
barracks and
engage in the
bases of
contest of
Italy,
strength altogether.
German soldiers confronted
They
their
buried
former
their
allies
rifles
with a
together.
simple choice: join
They
us
kept
or be
fighting
imprisoned.
anyway.
And
in
in
doing
stationed
so,
in the
they
Balkans,
proved that
in
warfare
Greece,
isn't always
in the
about who
occupied
has the bigger
territories,
gun or
the
the stronger
situation
army.
was even more desperate. Sometimes it's about
Captain
who can
Marini's
outlast the
regiment had
occupation,
been stationed near Brindisi,
who can maintain
guarding
their
the
humanity
Adriatic
in the
coast.
face of dehumanization.
When the armistice came,
Who
they
can
found
resist
themselves
without
surrounded
surrounded
by
by
German
German forces
forces
who
who
moved with the efficiency
The
of an
rifles
army
rested
that
in
had
the
planned
ground.
for exactly this contingency.
But what those men discovered
The
about
German
resistance
commander had been about dignity, about survival. Italian soldiers would be disarmed and transported to Germany as laborers that remained sharp and useful long would be separated and sent to prisoner of war beyond repair. Anyone who resisted was always the real weapon. The regiment
Not
had been
the
given
rifles
until
they buried,
dawn to
but
assemble
the understanding
processing.
they reached in the act of burying
Instead,
them,
Marini and
resistance
42
takes many
men who
forms,
trusted him
and
had slipped
sometimes
away
the most
in the
effective
darkness.
form is the one that looks like
They
nothing at all.
walked east, away from their barracks,
Marco Benedetti,
away from their
in his
German
final
captors,
interview before
into the
his death in
limestone hills that
2018,
offered concealment
was asked
but little
one
else.
last time about that night in
They had
September
weapons, but
1943.
carrying them made them targets.
We were terrified,
They
he
had
said
uniforms,
simply,
but wearing them
we
made
didn't
them
know
prisoners.
if we were being brave or cowardly.
They had training, but
We were
conventional
just trying
military
to survive.
tactics were useless against an
But
occupying
somehow,
force
in
that
trying to
controlled
survive,
every road,
we found
every
a way to
port,
fight that
every
the
city.
Germans couldn't defeat.
What they needed was a
Because you
different kind
can't
of
shoot
war.
what you can't see.
A war fought without
You can't
uniforms,
imprison what has
without
no fixed
formations,
identity,
without the rules that had
You
governed
can't
their
crush
lives as
resistance that
soldiers.
exists in a thousand
But
small
that transformation
acts rather than
required
organized
shedding
cells.
everything they'd been trained to be.
We buried our rifles.
It required burying the
And we
identity
kept
they
fighting
carried for
anyway,
years and becoming something
not
new.
in spite of being unarmed.
So here
but
they
because
were,
we were
in the
unarmed,
darkness, placing their
That was the
rifles in the
secret.
earth. That was
When
what
the
they
last
could
weapon
never
had been
understand.
added to the pile,
He
Captain
was
Marini
quiet
began
then,
covering
lost
them
in
with
memories of a
stones and
night
dirt.
75 years earlier.
The others
when
joined
42 frightened men had
They
made a
worked
choice
quickly
that would
now,
define
with
the rest of their
urgency,
lives.
knowing that German
When
patrols
they
would be
buried their
searching these
identity
hills
as
by
soldiers
morning.
and discovered something
The
stronger
rifles
beneath.
disappeared beneath limestone
When they'd
rocks
learned that
and red
sometimes
soil.
you have to bury your weapons
The
to
bayonets,
understand what you're
the
really
ammunition
fighting
belts,
for, the military equipment
and sometimes
that marked
the
them
most
as powerful
soldiers,
act of
all of it
resistance
went
is
into the
simply
ground.
refusing to disappear.
What remained were 42 men in Italian army uniforms with no weapons, no supplies, and no clear plan beyond survival. But they were free. Free from their obligations to an army that no longer existed, free from the rules that had governed military conduct, free to fight the war on their own terms. Private Benedetti watched the burial with an expression that was difficult to read. Fear, perhaps. Or relief. Or the strange combination of both that comes when you realize that everything you understood about your life has just been erased. What are we now? He asked quietly. If we're not soldiers. Captain Marini stood, brushing dirt from his hands. He looked at the young private, then at the others who waited in the darkness for an answer.